Welcome to all of our Max members and friends who are here. We're very happy to host you at the Metro Atlanta Exchange for Workforce Solutions this morning. My name is John Helton. I am the Executive Director of Atlanta Career Rise, but today I'm sitting in for Amy Lancaster, who's our Chair of Max. I'm actually the Vice Chair of Max this year, and we're very happy to welcome Max Carnathan, who I'm going to introduce a little bit more in just a minute. Before we get started, all of our work is due to sponsors and to the generosity of the people who support us. I want to thank Department of Human Services. I want to thank WorkSource Georgia, WorkSource Metro Atlanta, our friends at our 5 regional workforce boards here in the Metro Atlanta area. Obviously, Goodwill of North Georgia, the Metro Atlanta Chamber of Commerce, Atlanta Gaslight, and then my organization, Atlanta Career Rise, is also an anchor sponsor, anchor member of Max as well. So on behalf of the board, thank you to all of our sponsors, and thank you all for being here this morning. Give you a quick rundown of how this morning is going to flow. We have an hour together this morning. It's very important information. Mike Carnathan, as we were preparing for this call earlier this week, I was asking for rainbows and sunshine in his presentation, and I think the only rainbows and sunshine we have today are going to be outside for just a little bit this morning before maybe the rain moves into Atlanta, which is reflective of the presentation that Mike is going to present today. Is what he's promised me. So the doom and gloom perhaps of the presentation and some of the data that we're going to go over today may not be the prettiest picture that's being painted for us, but it's really important information for us to have as workforce development professionals, because right now is an opportunity and the time for us to be pivoting and planning for what's next, and to take an assessment of where we stand, and to rally and marshal our resources, and to really rally around the future of workforce development and where we're going as we move into the recovery phase. So with that, I'll shut up, and I would like to turn it over to Mike Carnathan. Mike is our friend at Atlanta Regional Commission. He doesn't know his job title, but he is the data guy, and he's the data guy that's not only really smart, but he also has the wonderful ability to put data into context and to be able to tell us what to do with the data and to give us some guidance around that as well. So with that, Mike, take it away. And thank you all for being here.
All right, I'm going to start sharing my screen and see how this works. Let's see. Good morning, everyone. How is everybody? I hope you can now see my screen. John, can you give me a screen check? You can see it? Okay. Again, my name is Mike Carnathan. I head up research at the Atlanta Regional Commission, and I'm just very happy to be here today to try to share some information of what we're thinking about in terms of the economic impact of COVID-19. Now, just a couple of points before I begin. As you know, this is an ever-evolving. Hold on one second. I'm trying to get. Okay. As you know, this is an ever-evolving crisis. And so a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be sharing with you, you guys already know. And that's going to be, you know, whether you intuitively know that, or with this crowd, it's you probably empirically know some of these things. So really the purpose of this presentation is really just kind of stitching together a narrative using the best available data that we can find. Secondly, and we have to acknowledge this, it's very hard to get a grasp on this. I mean, I think we're 8 weeks into, you know, after sort of the major lockdown orders started, and we're still learning things every single day. And the fact that this is a two-pronged crisis, one with a healthcare and an economic crisis, and both are kind of interplaying with each other. You know, we don't really know the economic impact without knowing how we're going to react to the health side of this crisis and vice versa. It's just an ongoing learning process. So in that spirit, but what I'm doing today is trying to focus as much as I can on the economic impact. So I just implore all of us today is just to kind of stay in the spirit of exploration, because that's what this is. And what I'll do after this presentation is I will share a link to this presentation, not the actual presentation, but a link to this presentation, because this is something that as we learn more, I'm going to keep adding to this presentation. So I want y'all to have the link so you can have, you know, sort of the live updates to this presentation as we go. Okay, so now let's get started. And one of the things that I always like to start with is we always get asked at the Atlanta Regional Commission about models, and we do have lots of models. We have kind of a state-of-the-art transportation model. We have a state-of-the-art land use model. We have a REMI model that is an econometric model that looks at forecasts. And so we do actually think a lot about modeling, and we're pretty good at it. But one of the things that is just really big lift is kind of modeling something that's unprecedented like this. And I know that we are getting tired of the word unprecedented, but that's exactly what this crisis is. So this, I've ran into this sort of a comic strip. And what it does is really just kind of talks about the difficulties that everyone is having. Now, of course, any good model starts with good data. And so that's really what I'm going to be focusing on, is the data part. And then later on in the presentation, I'll start talking a little bit about the modeling efforts that we've done initially. Okay, so we all know the news. We're all seeing headlines like this. This is the latest Time magazine. They're calling it the Great Reckoning. And it looks scary. It looks like something out of Dante's Inferno, but that is the time that we are in. And as John said, I was talking about what broad brush strokes of what I was going to be talking about, and there is no happy news here. I mean, if you look at, any economist kind of thinking about what's going to happen, those scenarios range from pretty bad to just like really, really terrible bad. So just kind of brace yourselves, because there's not going to be a lot of happy news in this presentation. Now, here is a very recent survey from the National Association of Business Economics, and the forecasts and predictions and projections are all over the place. There's a reason they call economists a dismal science, because there's just not a lot of consensus out there. Now, one of the things that we're looking at is, on the public health side of this, is we're trying to understand when that curve is going to be flattening. And that's one of the challenges that we have in really talking about what's exactly happening right now, is because this is moving all over the place. We're getting more and more cases, but we're getting more and more testing, so we don't know what kind of interplay more testing has. Is the virus getting worse? Is it getting better? We just don't really know, because there's so many factors in play. Now, one of the things we have been seeing, though, is these little orange dots over here on the right side of this blue line is actually good news, because that means, the 5-day model is, we're not quite meeting those expectations. So that's kind of what we want to see. But again, it's just too early to really get a good information from kind of these health models just yet. The Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland does a survey, and they ask a simple question about this: what do you think the duration of the coronavirus is going to be? And so when they first asked this in March, and this would be March 10th, so this is sort of that week when everything started getting locked down. Roughly, more than half of the people surveyed thought that this was just going to be less than 6 months. Yes, we're going to go through something, but it'll be short duration, and then we'll get on the other side of this pretty quickly. And then, as you see, as time goes on, we now see that more than 2/3 of those respondents think that this is going to last a year or longer. And it's kind of a goofy sort of survey question, because they don't include a response for 6 months to a year. But anyway, but the point remains. And so we've seen, this stuff, we've seen, just tremendous increases in initial claims for unemployment insurance. And we're also beginning to see this. And this is, it's not what I'm showing is the indicator itself is not important. what's important is these big lines going downward. So one of the things with labor market information, or at least traditional labor market information, is there's usually a pretty big lag of at least a month, sometimes 3 months, to really understand what's happening to the economy. So we're still in that kind of stage where we don't have, where the traditional labor market information isn't quite catching up with what's happening. But we're beginning to see some things. Like this is retail sales, and you see that big spike downward. So we're beginning to see that. Here's industrial production. You're beginning to see that big spike go down. Light vehicle sales, you can barely see it over here, but even car sales are beginning to go down. And disposable income, you know, we've been on a nice run here for quite a while, but now you'll see that spike going down with disposable income. And then, you know, if you talk about the unemployment insurance claims, they are concentrated exactly in the industries where you think. And so this is just kind of a normalization of unemployment insurance claims by industry. And then I just used total jobs as the denominator. It's not a perfect way to normalize this, but it does give you an idea of to see where these are being concentrated in. And it is accommodation and food services and arts and entertainment. But you'll see, you know, really no sector of the economy is being unscathed right now. Now, whenever I'm asked to think about or research something, you know, the first thing I do is go to the Google. And Google has actually done good things by creating something that they're calling mobility reports. And what it does is just tracking cell phone movement, right? And so Google is looking at a baseline, which is roughly January to February, and seeing how much movement to these types of places has declined. And so you'll see like retail and recreation compared to the baseline, well, that's down 40%. Grocery and pharmacy is down, but not that much. Visits to parks have actually gone up in Georgia. But transit stations, this is something that, you know, we at the Atlanta Regional Commission, as the Metropolitan Planning Organization, which is a transportation planning function, this has us very concerned because we understand that public transportation is taking a beating right now. And we had a webinar this week talking about just how much how much travel has really slowed down, and that's going to impact funding for MARTA. It's going to impact funding for all transit systems. And with, you know, decreased VMT, we're also talking about decreased fuel tax collections. And that's going to affect our ability to fund projects. And so this is something that we're obviously keeping a very close eye on as we move forward. And then other things we can learn from the Google is, you know, obviously, you know, we've seen a decline in visits to workplaces and a concomitant increase in visits to residential. So in other words, we're just staying home more. Now, Bloomberg has kind of a real-time recovery tracker on their website. So I just stole this from them, and they're looking at, you know, roughly 10 to 12 key indicators. And most of the things that they're tracking, well, they're tracking downward. So here we're looking at, again, that public transit ridership trend. This is national. It's affecting us locally here too, but you'll see that that has gotten worse as well. And so the way that this chart works is blue means better, orange means worse. So you'll see public transportation is trending in the wrong way. Mortgage applications. So the housing market, we're going to have to start figuring out what's happening in the housing market too, as more and more people lose their jobs, their ability to pay rent, and their ability to pay their mortgage will start coming into question. And then consumer comfort, into the better part of March, consumer comfort was kind of fine. But now you'll see, the lower the number gets, the less consumers are comfortable with this economy. Obviously, air travel is severely limited. We're just not flying at the same rate. We went from roughly 190,000 flights per day to, somewhere around 50,000 flights per day recently. We're not driving as much either. We've already talked about that. And anybody who gets on the connector, you know, at 4:30, or at least a couple of weeks ago, you could see that, you know, we're kind of at free flow speeds. And then back to that housing point, we're already beginning to see missed rent payments. And so this is from the National Multifamily Council, and they track, you know, percentages of people making rent payments by the 1st of the month. And then they have it, you know, by the 5th, the 12th, the 19th, the 26th. And what you'll see is, you know, typically about 5% of folks just miss their rent payments. Now it's roughly about 8% of folks who are missing their rent payments. And this is just for April. We don't have May numbers yet, but we do expect that percentage to keep declining. Now, obviously, travel has slowed down. Certain places are doing okay. And so this is data from SafeGraph. And SafeGraph, again, is one of those companies that tracks cell phone movements. They know where your cell phone lives because, you know, that's where it's at home at night. And then they also know where your cell phone goes, and they can actually track it to specific places. So you'll see, like, you know, Home Depot. Well, Home Depot is actually doing great because we're all of a sudden become gardeners and do-it-yourselfers. And so you'll see that visits to Home Depot have increased, whereas visits to places like Starbucks, you know, and remember, Starbucks is that place where people used to linger. They would go and they just, you know, get their coffee, get their scones, and they would linger at these places. Well, you can't linger at these places anymore. So places like Starbucks are suffering. And in terms of just overall mobility trends, Metro Atlanta really isn't that different. So what this is this little spaghetti chart is just showing you traffic by metropolitan area, and each one of these little spaghetti strands represents a metro, and you'll see they're all tracking each other. And here in this case, Metro Atlanta isn't really any different. And if you look carefully, if you kind of look at my cursor, that blue line represents Metro Atlanta. So while the overall trend doesn't look too dissimilar, if you look a little bit more careful, you'll see that, you know, we're kind of increasing our overall travel a little bit more than some of these other metros who were hit very hard or hit early, like Seattle, like San Francisco, and like New York. Now, here's some more data that we're getting from Opportunity Insights, and this is that Raj Chetty group, and they're publishing a bunch of data that's brand new. And so we can see small business revenue is cratering in Metro Atlanta. So we're seeing, you know, about a 50% decline in revenues going to small business. Overall, consumer spending is down about 33% in Metro Atlanta. And here you can also look at it by, you know, consumer spending in certain sectors. So transportation spending, that's down about 77%. Healthcare spending, which, you know, is not intuitive. You would think that since this is a healthcare crisis that we would be spending more. Actually, that's not the case because we have so many non-essential, you know, elective procedures that just aren't happening. We aren't visiting doctors' offices because we're afraid of catching the virus. And so that translates into about a 50% decrease in healthcare spending. And then obviously entertainment spending is down, you know, almost 80%. But one thing that is up is groceries. So we are spending more and more money on groceries. And here, what's interesting is, you know, you'll look at the peak right here, and that's that kind of that March 13th week where things started locking down. And so here's everyone rushing out to the grocery store to make sure that they stock up. But you'll see that for the most part, consumer spending in groceries has been up. And so another thing that we can get from SafeGraph is they track movement by cell phone, so they know who is actually staying home. And so here on this map, this is by neighborhood. And so you can see the darker the blues, the more of time you are spending at home. And so you'll see Metro Atlanta compared to the rest of the state. Well, Metro Atlanta is doing pretty good at staying home when compared to the rest of the state. And we can kind of zoom into the core county areas and see, you know, those dark blues, you know, represent up to 65% of people never leaving their home. And so their measure of staying at home is very strict. And it's essentially, you know, if you leave, you know, your 500 square foot little geo hash, you're considered not staying at home. Now, one of the things that we've been seeing since we can track this in real time is we've been seeing slowly, especially over the last week, travel ticking back up. Now, this is a Tableau dashboard that we built. I encourage you to look at it and spend some time with it. It's on our blog, 33in.atlantaregional.com. And what you'll see is, and you know, I know this is a very busy chart, but essentially what you're looking at is all these lines, they represent an industry. I'm trying to find my cursor. But you'll see them all kind of shooting up over the last week. And those lines shooting up, well, they correspond to the reopening orders from Governor Kemp. Now, let's talk a little bit more about kind of some industry-specific stuff and what we're seeing from the demand side. So we see the demand from employers is collapsing. This is Burning Glass data. And what Burning Glass does is they track number of postings from employers. And you'll see that that has slowed down. But again, it's not all bad. If you look at industry-specific stuff or sector-specific stuff, there are some areas that are kind of surging. Again, we all are tapping into our crafty side. And so we've seen increases in spending on activity-based toys and books. We've also spending more money on electronic gadgets for the kitchen, things like refrigerators and hot plates. And also one thing that I think, you know, that is probably going to stick once we're on the other side of this is consumer spending online has risen too. And so I think, you know, I mean, that's the online retail sector has always been kind of gaining ground on your traditional retail sector. But I think once we get on the other side, we'll see even a larger proportion of purchases remaining online. Okay, so now we're going to fundamentally shift into a discussion of vulnerabilities. And so this kind of extends into two fronts. One is just a discussion of vulnerable industries. And we've already kind of talked about that. And again, you guys already know which industries are suffering the most because we do have at least 8 weeks of experience with this. But what I really wanted to focus on when discussing vulnerabilities is discussing who is vulnerable. And unfortunately, I think we all know the answer to that question as well. So let's get into this. Let's talk about vulnerability from a standpoint of our economic composition. So this is one, I guess, economic shop. They did an assessment of every single major sector and they ranked it from most vulnerable to least vulnerable, and then essentially gave every single metro in the nation kind of a score. And here, with using this, you'll see that Atlanta kind of has average vulnerability. And that's due because, you know, Atlanta has a very broad-based economy. And so we don't have one sector dominating all the other sectors. And so it makes sense that we would kind of be assessed as having average vulnerability to COVID. But also makes sense if you see the metros over here that are most vulnerable. Well, you have Maui, you have Atlantic City, and you have Las Vegas. Obviously, you know, entertainment, tourism, food and accommodation, hotels, any one of those that are very reliant on tourism or entertainment, obviously they're going to be most vulnerable. And it also makes sense if you look at the other end of the scale as the metros that are least vulnerable to this, and that's Trenton, New Jersey, and Jefferson City, Missouri. And that's because Jobs EQ ranks government employment as safe, at least for now. And Trenton and Jefferson City are both capitals. And so they have a lot of government employment. So that's why they're viewed as relatively safe, at least for now. But we know there's a coming tide with sales tax revenues decreasing. And so local governments and governments will be struggling. Here is a second way of assessing vulnerability of Metro Atlanta. And this is from Brookings. And Brookings didn't do as broad of a look at the economy. They really focused on some key sectors that are getting hammered the hardest, like food and accommodation, like leisure hospitality, like air transportation. And so that's why here, under this assessment, Atlanta is viewed as quite vulnerable. And again, you see the kind of the same metros popping out as most vulnerable, and some of the metros popping out, some of the same metros popping out as least vulnerable. And here is, if you look at the specific kind of sub-industries, what you'll see is, temporary help services. So that's going to be your employment services, helping people get temporary jobs or job placement. You'll see full service restaurants and limited service restaurants. Those are among the most threatened by these movement restrictions. And one thing that really pops out, if you look at the scatter plot, is number one, they employ a lot of people. Full service restaurants, limited service restaurants together employ, almost 200,000 people. And they're also among the lowest paying wages. And so here, we're going to start pivoting to when our discussion of vulnerabilities to people. And so this is another thing that we have put together on our blog. It's one of these complicated charts, but it's really looking at, number one, if you kind of look up and down, so the y-axis, what this chart is showing you is that all types of businesses have been affected by these travel restrictions. But within that limited traveling sphere, retail trade is really popping out. And so they're gathering more and more of the share of visits by industry. You'll see accommodation and food suffering. And then here you'll see education services, with schools closing. Obviously, no one's going there anymore. Now, if we talk about who exactly is most vulnerable, again, unfortunately, we already know the answer to that question. It's people of color. And so people of color are already way more likely to not make a living wage. And so this is just looking at the percent of population making at least $15 an hour. People of color are way less likely to make $15 an hour. Now, switching back to the public health side of this, you will see that our Black populations, while they represent around 31% of the population in Georgia, they represent nearly 60% of the cases and 60% of the deaths to COVID. And that's not just a Georgia story. So if you see other states, including the District of Columbia, it's the same thing. The percent of deaths due to COVID is outstripping the percent of population in many states. And here's a map from the DPH mapping the number of cumulative cases by neighborhood. And this is a statewide. And so you'll see, right in here, if you can follow my cursor, you'll see this is South Fulton. Here's sort of Cobb. Here's South DeKalb. And again, if you look at maps, and I'll show you these maps, this is where our people of color are most heavily concentrated, is right in these areas. And of course, before moving on, we have to acknowledge what's happening in Southwest Georgia. It is an absolute tragedy down there. And this is, and then if you come back up to the Northeast and Hall County up here, this map was really kind of one of the first maps to show kind of that emerging hotspot up in Hall. Now, this is a map of the threatened workers. So all this is just the percent of workers. So this isn't percent of jobs. This is percent of workers who work in the food and accommodation industry or the arts and entertainment industry. And so the darker the browns and the oranges, those represent the heaviest concentration of threatened workers. And you'll see, you know, if you've ever looked at one of these maps that I make, this is a very familiar spatial pattern. And we can break it down a little bit. So if you look at that threatened worker map and you take the 100 highest neighborhoods with the highest concentration of workers in those two industries, this is how the composition of the population breaks down. Number one, in those 100 most economically vulnerable areas, well, about 28% of the populations living in those areas don't have health insurance, compared to 5.5% for all other areas. In the most vulnerable areas, about 54% of the population is Black, compared to 9.7% in all other areas. That trend is reversed when you look at white populations, and then you come over to Hispanic populations and you see the same basic trend where about 23% of population in those 100 most economically vulnerable areas are considered to be Hispanic, whereas only 6.3% in all other areas. So this was sort of a gut punch to me because, I mean, quite frankly, before this crisis, Metro Atlanta was scored among the worst in the nation on several equity measures. And what we're seeing is that this crisis is taking the largest toll on our people of color. And so what's happening is if these trends continue, we're actually going to get out of this a less equitable place. And so let's just look at some spatial disparities here a little bit. So there's that percent of threatened workers map, and we can compare that to the dispersion of people of color. So again, dark browns on both maps represent highest concentrations. And so you'll see some similar patterns. Here's percent of low birth weight births. And so that's sort of, you know, speaks to medically vulnerable populations. Percent lacking health insurance, again, kind of a medically vulnerable population. And then here's percent in poverty, which is an economically and financially vulnerable population. And so you'll see this is a perfect storm for our equity challenges here in metropolitan Atlanta. Now, and I wish I could say that we were sort of figuring this out before this pandemic hit, but we weren't. And so this is in one of those complicated charts that I like to make, but essentially what we're looking at is we're looking at sort of the lowest wage occupations that employ a lot of people throughout the nation. And we're looking at some peer metros with Metro Atlanta. The bars that go up represent wages increasing in these industries. And then the taller the bar, the higher the wage has increased since 2013. So one thing that immediately stands out is you don't see very many tall bars in Metro Atlanta, period. And actually you see several of our bars going down, which means that even before this crisis hit, many of these workers in these low wage occupations were actually making less today than they were 5 years ago. And so again, this is just a perfect storm where, you know, we were already having struggles with equity issues. You know, we're #1 in the nation in income inequality. That's for the city of Atlanta. We also have some of the lowest rates of upward economic mobility. And so any strategy that we're thinking about, there's that old adage, you never let a crisis go to waste. And, you know, there is discussions about how can we make a more equitable system for Metro Atlanta once we get on the other side of this. Well, if we don't center any if we don't center any strategy around equity, we're not thinking about the right things. So now let's get into some of the economic modeling. And here we're going to look at two things, really kind of a lightweight model, which is essentially just a kind of a multiplier model. And that's a tool that we've built that's on our website that anyone can play around with. And then we're also going to look at our heavyweight model, REMI, which is an econometric dynamic model that is a national model that lots of the premier economists and economy shops in the nation use. So in terms of lightweight model, again, we're just using a multiplier effect. So this is really more like a what if. And what it does, it allows you to come in and what we have done is we've sort of pulled out the industries or the sub-industries that we think are going to be most at threat due to COVID. And then you choose one of those, and then you kind of, and then there's a slider that lets you choose what percentage of those jobs you think will be lost. And then what it tells you is, okay, if you lose 50% of jobs in full service restaurants, the direct impact on that is 54,663 jobs. The indirect is 66,000 because, any job loss will have ripple effects throughout the entire economy. And then this actually allows you to look at the specific industries that might be impacted. And you can also look at the compensation that entails and the sales that entails. So that's for full service restaurants. Some of these industries that are going to be impacted have a larger multiplier effect. So here's air transportation. If we take down 50% of jobs in air transportation, it translates only in air quotes, to 15,000 jobs lost. But from the indirect, once you add in the indirect and induced impacts, that turns out to be closer to 27,000 jobs. And then here you see all the other industries that are impacted. So that is a tool that's on neighborhoodnexus.org. If you go to our website, the first thing you'll see is kind of a COVID-19 page or a link to a COVID-19 page. If you click on that, you can play around with this tool and all the other tools that we've built, helping, trying to understand what's actually happening in this economy. Now, moving on to the heavier weight models, what we did is the first thing that we did is we identified, really kind of doing kind of a lit review of what other folks are thinking about and what industries are going to be, impacted the most, both negative and positive. So we have a list of distressed industries and we have a list of surging industries. And what we did is we tricked the model, not really tricked the model, we modified the model to take down output in these industries that are distressed, while at the same time kind of increasing output in the industries that were surging. And what this essentially comes down to is we can look at it quarter by quarter, and this is kind of our worst case scenario. We did look at several different scenarios, some of them mild, some of them, pretty critical. And what we're looking at, and this is the worst case scenario. So what we're seeing is, job losses, maybe upwards of 600,000 in kind of quarter two. And then we're not really even quarter two of 2021. And then we're not even seeing kind of a rebound in job growth until quarter three of 2021. And this is sort of the worst case scenario. Now the policy levers that we're adjusting include, labor force participation. And when you talk about labor force, you're talking about people. So you have to kind of make some assumptions about the health of the population. And then obviously supply and demand. And then that behavioral influence is really kind of guiding the severity of our scenarios. And then if you want to just look at total numbers, and this is sort of a different look at that chart that I just showed you, because this is sort of averaging it out over the 4 quarters of 2020. The worst case scenario has us losing 538 jobs by the end of the year. a 14% decline in GDP in Q2, and then about $28 billion loss in disposable personal income. Now, one note about models is it's very hard for a REMI model. So in an econometric model, it's dynamic, but it's always seeking equilibrium. It's trying to get to some sort of best fit going out into the future. And so when you talk about financial shocks that hit us this quickly, the REMI model it doesn't quite know what to do with this. And so we're struggling trying to understand what inputs and outputs and levers to press in our model to, number one, understand just the financial shock that's happening. And then more importantly, trying to understand the economic stimulus or economic relief package that the feds are passing. So, you know, that $2.2 trillion of relief, we tried to do some initial modeling on that, and that really kind of broke the model because you can't just put in $2.2 trillion of relief package into a model and expect it to act rationally. But our early indications are that if you look at some of that relief and doing our best to kind of put it into the right places in the model, some of these job losses that we're seeing could be stemmed by, could be mitigated by like 15 to 20%. So it's not like the stimulus is going to stop all job loss, but right now our thinking is that stimulus will sort of stave off about 20% of these jobs lost, upwards of 20%. But again, this is the initial modeling. We're still trying to figure out what levers to press in terms of that stimulus. So kind of wrapping up here. So summing up, as of a couple weeks ago, we had about 600 or more than 600,000 workers had continued unemployment insurance claims. And so what this kind of roughly equates to, and then look, this is back of the napkin stuff here. It roughly equates to about a 20% unemployment rate, about $1.5 billion in lost compensation per month. So those are those workers that aren't getting paid anymore. So that's $1.5 billion, and about $5 billion in lost sales per month due to those businesses closing or having limited hours. And then some other things we want to think about, and this is shifting from pure economics to more of the social side of things that obviously is going to have economic impacts, is food insecurity is about to become even a bigger issue once the school year is over. In other words, once schools start closing their cafeterias for summer, we always have these summer feeding programs, but I think the demand for more food is going to overwhelm the capacity of these summer feeding programs. So we need to figure out kind of a strategy for the summer to make sure that kids and families remain fed. We also know that the majority of licensed child care centers have temporarily closed. What we don't know is how they're going to reopen or if they're going to reopen. Obviously, in the education realm, absenteeism in this virtual world has skyrocketed. And so now we're concerned about losing a lot of the gains that we've made over the past 5 years in third grade reading and 8th grade math, just numeracy overall. And we're trying to get a handle on, just how much of those gains are we going to give back. And again, you saw that chart that we've seen a spike in people unable to pay rents. That's only going to get worse as more and more people lose jobs, as more and more people struggle with their budgets. We also talked about transportation, about how that's harder to access. Transit schedules are becoming more and more limited. It's getting in Ubers and Lyfts, those are, that's kind of an iffy proposition now. And so getting the kind of the new essential workforce to work is even harder now. because, you know, we're just limiting our transportation options. And then finally, you know, we've been doing some surveying at ARC with some of our arts organizations, trying to understand, since arts and entertainment is one of the most impacted industries, we're trying to figure out what the impact is. And we're still doing that surveying, but, you know, one of the findings that we've seen is, you know, a little bit more than 50% of arts organizations report concerns about being able to survive this economic downturn. Now, a lot of them are really relying on federal relief. And so if they get that federal relief, they're a little bit more confident in their ability to survive. But the fact of the matter is, we're entering a kind of uncharted territory in how arts organizations that rely on physical presence, relies on audiences, how are they going to adapt to kind of this new thing? And here I'm just waving my arms at everything. How are they going to adapt to this? And so that is all I had. So I'm going to turn it back over to John to see if there's any questions that we may have.
Thank you, Mike. Well, you certainly didn't fail to deliver on the doom and gloom. Thank you very much.
Well, I told you.
You know, I'm looking at the chat box, and while I'm making a couple of comments here and observations, you all please feel free if there are specific questions to please go to the chat box. Joy's monitoring it, and I'm trying to take a look as I'm talking to make sure that we answer everyone's questions, or if there's anything that you'd like Mike to follow up on, he can certainly do that. I know that he's competent. We can put him on the spot. And Mike, I'm going to pose a question right now, and then I'm going to talk to not put you completely on the spot. But if you could, just as a follow-up or wrap-up, a final wrap-up, you know, as workforce development agencies and professionals, what is it in your mind's eye right now based on the data and knowing that people really aren't going back to work in mass right now? We're still waiting for that wave to hit, I believe. What is it that workforce professionals can be doing right now to best position themselves? And if you could just ponder that for a moment, I'll look and see if there are any more questions. I know that there were a couple of questions that came up during the presentation. Let's address those. Someone asked what an MPO was. It's a Metropolitan Planning Organization, for which Atlanta Regional Commission is for the Atlanta region. Mm-hmm. And then someone asked if we'll be sending out a copy of this presentation, and this is excellent data. We'll be doing even better. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but I think Mike opened the presentation by saying we're going to send you a link to this because much of the slides are dynamic slides, dynamic data, and ARC and Mike will be continuing to update this, so we'll get the freshest data as it's available. Is that correct, Mike? Absolutely.
Yep, I will share a link to this, and so what that means, it's a live link, so whenever I update it, you'll get those updates.
Okay, that's excellent. So even better than getting the presentation, you'll get the link to where you'll be able to get the data. So we do have a question here. I'll read it for you. Mike, what do you theorize that the new natural norm will be when things open back up? That's a big question. I don't know. So again, what do you think theorize that the new natural norm will be when things open back up?
And I wish I had a better question, and we could, and honestly, we could talk weeks about this. And I think everyone is struggling to figure that out. And I know that our school systems, so obviously one of the key things to get back to normal, and I'm using air quotes, I have my video on now so you can see me with my air quotes, is we have to figure out a way to reopen schools. Reopening schools means that parents can go back to work, and kids, get, more attention to their educational needs. So, and we don't know how that's going to work. And our educational systems, the school districts, they're all thinking about how do we do this. And so honestly, until we understand, well, really until we get a vaccine and a steady treatment for this, we don't even, it's even hard to conceptualize what the new normal will be. Now, I know from just talking from within my organization at the Atlanta Regional Commission, one thing I think will stick around from this is more teleworking. I mean, I think that teleworking is working great. I think definitely as we begin to go back to work, even without a vaccine, I don't think offices are going to just turn on the spigot full blast in terms of letting people get back to work. It's going to be more teleworking for those who can telework. And so what that means is for those jobs that can't do teleworking, we're going to see continued struggle. Because even though we are reopening and more restaurants are reopening, there's still a lot of concern out there from the public about visiting these places. And so I know that that's one thing that we're thinking about is, you know, those vulnerable occupations. They're going to remain vulnerable for a while, even as more and more businesses reopen. Now, I know I didn't quite tell you that. I mean, didn't quite answer your question, but it's just anything at this point is speculation and theory.
Yeah, I think it's a big question, and I think that answer did chip away at it. We have another question. Good morning, Commissioner Cupid. I miss you. Thank you for your question.
Oh, hey,
Yeah, Commissioner Cupid is asking, how can we use this data to inform how CARES money is spent to support small businesses? So I know that you had some information about small business in your presentation. Do you have any thoughts, Mike, about?
Yeah, that's a great question, Commissioner Cupid. What we're working with some of our partners now to understand. So what ARC recently did is we purchased this data set called BusinessWise, and I'm not doing this as an advertisement for BusinessWise. It's just that we recognize that there's a lot of philanthropy out there, and there's a lot of our local governments who are trying to work with small businesses to make sure that they can access this funding. And so part of the problem initially is that we don't really have a good sense of where our small businesses are. Don't really have, especially our local governments, we don't really have that two-way communication regularly with our small businesses. And so what BusinessWise data set allows us to do is allows us to identify, number one, what those small businesses are. And number two, BusinessWise gives us contact information for each of those businesses. So what we're doing is working with our partners to kind of start thinking about, okay, what is an engagement strategy that we can employ where we start contacting small businesses and giving them, you know, that hand-holding support that they need to access the CARES funding. And so these efforts are just beginning, and it's taking a long time. And unfortunately, as soon as, you know, the spigot gets turned on with this CARES funding, it's like gone within a week. And so, you know, we're always going to kind of be chasing that funding. But I mean, we're doing, you know, the best that we can to work with our partners and getting them the information they need to help small businesses.
Thank you. Another Q&A that's coming in, and this is another big question, and I know that you have some specific thoughts on it. We're receiving false data from media because of politics putting people at unnecessary fear. Are we receiving false data from the media because of politics putting people unnecessarily at fear? So it's kind of the other side of the coin.
Well, yeah, I think we are. And, you know, especially whatever, and that question is just rife with so many different ways that we can take that. I mean, so, you know, what is these days, you know? Yeah, there's all kinds of information out there. The information age means that we can go to any aspect of the internet and get all kinds of information. Much of it is going to be false. So what we're trying to do at the Atlanta Regional Commission, at least, is try to cut through the noise. And so we actually just had a conversation about this yesterday. We're going to start publishing kind of a one-pager or two-pager every week that just kind of gives you the kind of, okay, here's the most important information that we can glean. You know, things like, okay, here's the Here's the weekly unemployment insurance claims. Here's kind of the weekly case reports. Here's, you know, you're right. There's so much noise out there. It is so hard to get a common understanding of the problem. And if we don't have a common understanding of the challenge facing us, we are not going to come up with a common solution to this. And that's where everybody in this space is struggling right now. And so that's a very big question, but I think it really gets to the heart of where we're struggling to adapt to whatever this new normal is going to be, is because at the same time, we have an information overload, but we don't really even know what information we should be using. So, and that's one of the key core missions of Atlanta Regional Commission, is to try to cut through that noise and give you the best information that we can find to help you make, you know, those really hard decisions that we're going to have to make.
Thank you. So we're going to wrap this up, but I'm reading a comment that kind of echoes what I was going to close with. And as always, Clara, you've said this really well. I'm going to just read this to make sure everyone, it resonates. Great job as always, Mike. So once this gloomy picture really soaks in, we need to have some skill sessions on how we adapt. So that's our agenda for what's next. We can't continue to do the same thing in a changed environment. A specific example: how will we deliver education in new ways so we minimize absenteeism? How will we integrate equity principles into every strategy, no matter the subject matter? Amen. And strategy we execute. And most of all, we have to stop waiting. So Claire, thank you for that observation. As we wind down here, obviously, Mike, we thank you very much for presenting today. The information, again, doom and gloom, but let me just share a couple of comments about where, as I try to get myself together here, things that we can be doing right now. And I think the most important thing that we as workforce professionals and workforce organizations can do is to stay connected and to really educate ourselves and make sure that we understand the data and that we know what each other are doing in terms of service delivery and planning, so that we are coordinating and collaborating where that makes sense. Mike, I also want to thank you for calling out Ahmaud Arbery's murder in Southwest Georgia. I think that really speaks to the other problem that we have, and that's the disparate economic and health impacts that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on the Atlanta region, and as you said, reference to Washington, D.C. Data across the country. And that's something that, of course, we're trying to work with the Regional Workforce Initiative in really focusing in on race and place as a strategy to affect economic mobility. And then I know that many of us on this call are working in our respective organizations to do the same thing. So with that, one more announcement before I move on to closing this completely out. I've learned since we started this call that it's Mike's birthday today. Happy birthday, Mike. We
Yay, happy birthday, me.
That box and give him a big woohoo and happy birthday. And we'll take this moment to remember your Sean Cassidy hair that we were talking about earlier.
Oh, I know. I wish I could replicate that, but
and the memory of that anyway, right? So everybody, mark your calendars. The next Max Minutes, this format is going to be May 22nd at 9 a.m. We're going to have a guest from Accenture. He's going to be talking about Accenture's work with COVID-19 and specifically the federal stimulus packages. We all know how overwhelming and confusing that is to understand and absorb as that comes in and trying to decipher. And there's more on its way. This last week, the Relaunching America's Workforce Act for workforce development specifically was introduced, and we'll see when Congress reconvenes where that goes. We're hoping for the best, and some more workforce development resources to be coming down the pipeline. So keep your eye on that. Metro Atlanta Industry Partnership, which is a program of WorkSource Atlanta and Atlanta Career Rise. We're alternating with Max to provide delivery so that there's something available to our workforce development community every week. Our next webinar will be Thursday, May 28th from 10 to 11. If you're not already on the mailing list, which you probably are, receiving updates and links to register from Helen Slavin on our team, please email Helen. The next topic is going to be employment success supports and COVID-19, what we're learning and what's next. We've got a great panel lined up, including some representatives from Comcast to talk about business impacts. And that's really a great venue for business engagement for our workforce community. And then again, one more special thanks to our anchor organizations that you see their logos here. We really appreciate the support for Max and really appreciate your commitment to the work. And with that, I hope that you all have a wonderful weekend, a great Friday, and to our mothers out there, happy Mother's Day. Like whether you're